George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, Cesar Chavez. While American history is full of military men of rank who have led troops into battle, none can match Cesar Chavez's marshaling of farm workers to secure livable wages while regaining their dignity from an elite grower class that saw them as little better than a bag of seed to be manipulated for their own profit. Long before there was a march on Washington, led by Martin Luther King, farm workers had been at the mercy of growers who had controlled the jobs, wages, and working conditions in the fields. In 1962, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta started what would become the United Farm Workers after having witnessed the injustice workers face when they tried to unify and speak with a single voice. The American involvement in World War II had led to a manpower shortage as most able-bodied men were shipped off to Europe or the Pacific, thus depriving growers of the hands that were necessary to pick the nation's fruit and vegetables. Having grown accustomed to cheap labor during the Great Depression, growers pressured the government to create a guest worker program, which would allow them to recruit workers from Mexico. What resulted from this push was the Bracero program of 1942 to 1964. Originally designed to protect against a labor shortage caused by World War II, the Bracero program allowed growers to exploit agricultural workers through the payment of low wages and inhumane working conditions. Bracero participants were immigrants temporarily brought to the U.S. to work. Problems were immediately apparent as issues of unhealthy working conditions, low pay, and inadequate educational opportunities for the workers' children went on without answers. A whole day's back-breaking work amounted to $2 for the worker, whose life expectancy was 40 years old. The off and on of the program frustrated workers who never knew how long they would be allowed to stay. Threats from farmers to pull their support kept many workers silent. Cesar Chavez then stepped in to give these largely invisible workers the ability to be seen and heard. While his early steps centered upon Hispanics, he knew that farm workers of all races and ethnicities needed to band together if they were to win concessions from the growers. On August 4th, 1965, the first arrest of UFW members were recorded in Bakersfield, as 19 workers were arrested for picketing a grape orchard. Chavez and the UFW then merged with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, led by Larry Seven Fingers Italon. The AWOC was primarily a Filipino farm worker organization, but the two worker groups merged due to their common desire to win better pay and safer working conditions for their members. They also sought respect and the right to protest poor treatment in the work. In September 1965, the AWOC had gone on strike, seeking $1.40 an hour and 25 cents per box from Delano growers. The UFW joined the cause. In addition to being in conflict with the growers, the workers had to fight the power of government, as can be seen a few months later as consul generals from the Philippines urged Filipinos not to participate in the strike through paid radio advertisements. The use of institutions and the mass media to keep workers in line was a form of systematic oppression that had attempted to strip these people of their freedom of speech and association in America. The farm worker movement, being led by Chavez and the UFW, was hardly isolated and confined to one area. While the strike against Delano growers was in full swing, workers in the Imperial Valley were also in conflict with the growers. Imperial Valley growers faced 200 protesters threatening to sue over the grower failure to meet the imposed minimum wage of $1.40 an hour. Growers were upset with the farm workers, many of them undocumented citizens, because they had been given an opportunity at a life in the U.S. Growers knew that many other lines of work would refuse to hire these people, but the Bracero program had pretty much invited them specifically to do this line of work. So when they protested, growers didn't sympathize much with them. These men have chosen this type of work like farming. They have chosen this way of life, and if they were not happy, they wouldn't be here. Jack Pandol. Though the movement was unifying before Chavez and growing in strength, growers continued to show their disrespect by refusing to attend church-sponsored reconciliation meetings and getting the media to cast the workers as communist sympathizers, looking to raise the price of food. Powerful growers had also placed allies in government, such as California Employment Director Albert Tyberg, who pushed for striking workers to be fired.
We want to know why the sheriff refuses to go into the fields and take the arms away from those men. We also want to know why the sheriff is making a special point of these raids and these beatings on our picket lines.
The efforts of the farm workers to win concessions from the growers was not achieved without pain. The United Farm Workers Movement was the most important movement in recent memory due to the actual success despite the opposition. Despite peaceful protests organized by the UFW, there were still negative responses from the community. The marches and protests were seen as disruptive, and those who did not agree with the workers' actions would pelt them with rocks, and law enforcement did not take too kindly to the described disruption. On October 2, 1966, during a protest, a truck driver ran into the crowd of protesters and injured 2 strikers. The fight for better working conditions had become a full-fledged war. Filipinos had begun fading out of the narrative as well, with Larry Italong recently referring to Chavez as a dictator. It appeared that the conflict was coming from both internally and externally, even though people nationwide seemed to agree that these people deserved more. Growers, however, didn't see it this way. When worker solidarity began to crack, Cesar Chavez began a fast as penance for his role in the violence that had been occurring. Many began to question his leadership and methods, which were seen as passive and ineffective, as the goal was no more in sight after a few years of strikes than it had been before the workers had organized it in the first place.
That there's a great deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Non-resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and deadened complacency.
The difference between nonviolence and non-resistance brought much attention to these workers. Today, the use of nonviolence is one of the most iconic and effective acts of rebellion in the United States. There was a discussion about its effectiveness on both sides, as workers questioned whether or not nonviolence was just a waste of time, and growers knew that not only was time on their side, but so too was the available supply of cheap labor willing to cross picket lines. At this point, Chavez changed direction. Hoping to emulate the civil rights movement's attempt to change the hearts and minds of the American public, Chavez and the UFW asked people to boycott grapes. Growers saw this as unjust, but where they could find workers willing to undercut their economic competitor, growers couldn't find another set of buyers. Moving the strikes from the fields to the parking lots of grocery stores, the workers were no longer hidden from view. Slowly but surely, the public responded. The boycott went nationwide, and one by one they were forced to compromise with the striking workers. In the end, growers were left with no choice other than to recognize the United Farm Workers as a representative of people they were no longer able to exploit unconditionally. While the UFW continues to represent farm workers in 2017, these unseen workers continue to work on the margins of poverty. It has only been through the consistent effort of Chavez's organization and the power of the California government's regulatory power that these workers aren't more abused. Recent victories won by Chavez's army include the right for workers to have access to shade, restrooms, and water while at work. Conditions cashiers, waiters, and office workers take for granted have to be fought for by the United Farm Workers. Viva la causa.